This video is kindly sponsored by Keeps. Find out more later in the video. Hey, 42 here. On the 28th of February 2009, Russian-American woman Natasha Veruschka stood in front of a man holding a clipboard and several other onlookers. She picked up a 58cm long razor-sharp steel sword, tilted her head back and slid the blade down her throat until only the hilt was visible. A moment of disbelief and silence fell upon the crowd as the clipboard man quickly scribbled something. Remarkably, Veruschka did not start vomiting blood. Instead, she calmly and steadily pulled the blade back out her stomach, up through her esophagus, and out her mouth. She had just set the official world record for the longest sword ever swallowed in recorded history. Now, 58 centimeters is a fairly average length for a sword, but not a sword swallower's sword. They typically use much shorter and thinner blades to allow them a fighting chance of not stabbing up their insides. To give you an idea of how incredible Veruschka's record-breaking feat was, the length of your average female esophagus is 22.5 centimeters, meaning 35.5 centimeters of the sword she swallowed had to enter parts of the human body that are, let's just say, a lot bendier. Now, I wouldn't blame you if you think sword swallowing, as impressive as it looks, is just a visual illusion with lashings of theatre, like the old assistant getting sawn in half inside a box gimmick. But actually, no. Sword swallowers don't use collapsible swords. There are no mirrors, and usually no smoke. The steel blades they use are completely real. Usually they have rounded edges, but other performers like to use genuinely razor-sharp swords that could slice through a watermelon or vital organs without much effort. I'm so sorry to tell your anxiety, but sword swallowing is very real and extremely dangerous. It's a remarkable feat combining human endurance, mind over matter, and years of practice. And, as we're about to find out, it has a rich and wild history. Never mind sword swallowing, it's time to swallow your fears about losing your hair with Keeps. I've had people close to me start to lose their hair as early as their 20s, and it's always been an upsetting experience. If you're in the same boat, then you're not alone. Did you know 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35? But the best thing you can do to prevent hair loss is take the initiative now and do something about it whilst you've still got hair left. You used to have to go to the doctor's office for a hair loss prescription, but now, thanks to Keeps, you can visit an online doctor and get the medication you need delivered directly to your door. I like Keeps because it makes treatment super easy by delivering your hair loss medication every 3 months. There's a good reason that Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors, and hundreds of thousands of men trust them for their hair loss prevention medication. So, if you're like me, you're probably not ready to lose your hair just yet, but prevention is key. The faster you act, the faster you'll see results, and the sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. So, if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, do something about it. For a limited time, go to keeps.com/42 or click the link in the description below to receive 50% off your first order. Despite the obvious dangers, most of the time sword swallowing goes surprisingly well. A report by Sword Swallowers Association International asked 46 sword swallowers whether they'd been injured whilst practicing their craft. Most of them, unsurprisingly, reported having sore throats, known in the trade as sword throats. Many also reported lower chest pain, though apparently this clears up after a few days of not ramming several inches of sharp steel where it shouldn't go. Amazing! Others were a little less fortunate. 16 of the 46 swallowers surveyed had suffered intestinal bleeding, and 3 had ended up with serious injuries that required surgery. In one case, the performer claimed to have been distracted by his sidekick, a naughty parrot perched on his shoulder, resulting in a torn esophagus. Another was a belly dancer who, while swallowing 3 swords at once, lodged all 3 painfully in her esophagus after being distracted by a well-meaning audience member shoving dollar bills in her belt. Despite the risks, few sword swallowers, even those who end up needing serious surgery, die for their art. The Sword Swallowers Association International reports only knowing of 29 people worldwide who've died during the act since 1880, though they do admit that the real number is probably much higher. Surprisingly, many sword swallowers are self-taught, often as teenagers. But what goddamn teenagers are sitting in their bedrooms whilst their parents are cosily ensconced downstairs watching telly, thinking that attempting to shove a sword down their throat seems anything like a good idea? Perhaps it's the law of joining an ancient tradition, because sword swallowing is nothing new. The first were found in India 4,000 years ago. For those early pioneers, it was a religious act carried out by Hindu shamans and Islamic fakirs in order to demonstrate their apparent invulnerability and connection with the gods. Around the same time, they also developed snake handling and walking on hot coals, just in case the gods didn't think knocking back a sword was badass enough. One particular tribe in the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, known as the Konda Dora, have passed the art of sword swallowing down from father to son for generations. And they still do, to this very day. Can you imagine that? Are we going to play football again today, Daddy? No, today, son, we're going to ram a sword down your throat instead. From these tribal roots, sword swallowing went on to spread across the world. Though, to be fair, it took a while. In the 1st century AD, 2,000 years after those first Indian practitioners, it could be found on the streets and in the festivals of ancient Greece and Rome. Greeks and Romans are known to have traded with India, swapping wine and precious metals for spices, ivory, and silk. So perhaps the first Greek sword swallower was a trader who, enthralled by the performances he saw, decided to have a go himself. Around the 8th century AD, sword swallowing began to pop up in China and then in Japan, where it morphed into an acrobatic street art called sarugaku, which combines sword swallowing with juggling, miming, and dancing. In the Middle East in the 12th century, sword swallowing went back to its roots as a spiritual practice and was adopted by the mysterious dervishes. Dervishes are a devout order who believe the best way to connect with God is through experiences. And what better experience could there be in life than adorning a huge skirt and whirling around whilst painfully resisting the urge to vomit? But it turns out whirling dervishes also have a long tradition of sword swallowing, walking on hot coals, and eating glass, though presumably not at the same time as all the whirling. As the tradition moved through Europe, religion and sword swallowing didn't always get along quite so well, with the medieval Catholic Church and its holy inquisitions condemning it as a heretical practice. The prospect of being tortured as a heretic did put off some sword swallowers, but not all. I guess you could say they're not a particularly risk-averse bunch. Sword swallowing was seen across Europe in the medieval period as a popular street art, performed by wandering entertainers alongside more ordinary acts such as juggling, singing, and mime. The tradition began to die out in Europe after the Middle Ages, but it never truly disappeared. It was performed by buskers on the streets of Victorian London. And then, in late 19th century America, a sword-swallowing renaissance occurred after the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. Visited by 27.3 million people, it featured a sword-swallowing display that quickly caught the public's imagination, after which it became a regular feature of traveling sideshows and circuses across America. As public interest grew, so did the risks. sword swallowers began experimenting with multiple swords and even neon tubes. By the way, you really don't want one of those to explode inside of you. Edna Price, born in 1899, niece of a veteran sword swallower and friend of Harry Houdini, was known as the Queen of Sword Swallowers. She once swallowed 12 swords in one go, and then moved on to neon tubes that were so bright her audience could see them glowing through her throat. In the 1930s, she was a regular at the famous Ripley's Believe It or Not Auditorium in New York, which you can still visit in Times Square today. Edna lived until she was 88, so clearly the sword and tube swallowing did her no permanent damage. Frances Doran, a veteran sword swallower born in 1908, who spent decades working traveling sideshows and circuses, was not so lucky. In 1969 in Houston, a neon tube exploded in his throat, in front of an audience of 200, releasing gas and shattered glass inside his body. The tube was removed, but Francis was never the same again. He died 10 years later from pneumonia caused by the injuries. And then there was Hannibal Helmorto, a German tax inspector turned sword swallower, who tore a 4-inch hole in his esophagus while swallowing a neon tube in 12012. He spent several weeks in hospital, unable to speak, and was fed directly into his stomach. Amazingly, Hannibal returned, albeit nervously, to his profession, and decided he didn't quite come close enough to death last time, because he added swallowing hedge clippers and drill blades to his performance. If you want to have a go yourself, which you definitely shouldn't, ever, like seriously, there are some major biological hurdles you'll have to overcome. The irony of sword swallowing is that it doesn't actually involve any swallowing at all. In fact, swallowing is the last thing you want to do when a sword is lodged in your throat. The goal is to relax your throat muscles, not activate them. The first step is to carefully align the sword with a muscle called the upper esophageal sphincter, which sits in the middle of your throat, just behind your Adam's apple. You then need to tip your head far back to reduce the bends in your throat, making it as straight and in line with your esophagus as possible, giving the sword a relatively safe passage down. And whilst you're doing this, you need to stay completely relaxed. Yeah, good luck with that one. Your biggest obstacle will be fighting against your body's natural gag reflex. The last thing you want to do when you're half a sword down is vomit. For some, it takes years to overcome this powerful inbuilt defense, and many people never can. If you manage all that, next the sword moves between your lungs, perilously close to your heart. Sword swallowers are known to brush their heart during the act, and for some people the blade actually pushes the heart a couple of centimeters to the side during its passage. Yeah. Then the blade will pass the liver before finally settling deep down in the stomach. That is, thankfully, as far as you can go without killing yourself. None of these organs are naturally in a straight line. Performers line up their body in such a way that the sword has a relatively easy route into the stomach, which involves a few contortions, a lot of concentration, and a little bit of nudging your vital organs gently out of the way. Swallowers reports that they are constantly aware of every vital organ and its exact position. In fact, they must learn to feel this connection to prevent internal injuries. Some swallowers use lubrication, but others go completely au naturel. So, do you still fancy your chances? Yeah, I didn't think so. Despite its medical risks, sword swallowing has proved rather useful to our understanding of the human body over the years. In 1868 in Freiburg, Germany, a local doctor was so impressed by the performance of a visiting sword swallower, he examined the man's esophagus with a mirror, hoping to see exactly how he was able to so easily relax all his internal squishy bits that us, non-masochists, don't have any conscious control over. He knew that if the sword swallower could swallow a sword, he could swallow an endoscope tube. He became the subject of the world's first successful esophagoscopy, when another local doctor, Adolf Kusmol, asked him to swallow a primitive endoscope, which he used to examine his insides with the aid of a mirror and an oil lamp. Though despite these early achievements, it wasn't until the invention of the electric light that endoscopies really took off. Sword swallowing has also been used to study digestion. One 19th century Scottish doctor convinced a sword swallower to ingest metal tubes with holes in them, in which he'd placed pieces of meat. He then asked the participant to retrieve the tubes, one by one, at intervals, allowing him to examine the relative levels of digestion as time passes inside the body. Even as recently as 2007, Di Andrews, a 4-time world record-holding sword swallower, used his unique ability to help researchers at Johns Hopkins University study new techniques to aid patients recovering from severe throat injuries. Unsurprisingly, the Professional Sword Swallowing Club has a rather exclusive membership. The Sword Swallowers Association International says there are just a few dozen working today worldwide. Though they don't say how many amateurs are at it, it's estimated that learning the craft takes 3 to 7 years, and mastering it, another 5. Even for the most experienced pros, it never gets easy. The gag reflex can be managed, but it doesn't disappear with any amount of practice. That calm-looking demeanor you see on stage is a well-rehearsed facade to hide their watering eyes and desire to retch. Veteran sword swallowers sometimes end up with problems swallowing, severe acid reflux, or even esophageal cancer as a result of constantly bringing stomach acid up along with their swords. Unlike almost every other professional body in the world, the Sword Swallowers Association don't recommend that anyone ever becomes a sword swallower, describing their own work as extremely dangerous. You know what? I think I have to agree. So, on that note, I think I should end by simply saying, don't try this at home. Thanks for watching. Check out my new podcast, Random Interesting Facts, available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Link in the description below. Thanks.